All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Hamblett. I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings Magazine, and I think this morning's panel should be one of the most lively and interesting of the conference so far. Before we start, I'd ask you to silence your cell phones. And also remember at the end, Dave is going to open it up to questions. These are always better when we have lots of good, lively questions from the audience. When you ask a question, please go to one of the microphones because we're recording and webcasting this panel discussion. So this morning's discussion is titled Hyperwar: How do we develop and field the technology to win? We've got a great panel. Our moderator is Captain Dave Adams, U.S. Navy retired. Dave is a close friend of mine and a colleague from the Naval Institute. He was a career submariner who commanded a provincial reconstruction team in Khost, Afghanistan. He then commanded the USS Santa Fe, SSN 763, and the USS Georgia, SSGN 729. During his career ashore, Dave served in several key billets working on experimentation and new technology in the Navy, including as a member of the CNO Strategic Studies Group and the director of the Commander's Initiative Group at the U.S. 7th Fleet. And Dave was a pioneer and proponent of railgun and helped to, starting as a lieutenant, push that technology in front of the seniors in the Navy and convince them that this was part of the future of the Navy. As an author, Dave has been published in Proceedings Magazine more than 25 times during his career. He also won, not top three, but won 8 of our essay contests over the years. Since his retirement in 2016, Dave served as the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings. He was my predecessor. I owe him beers for the fact that I now have that great job. He left us last summer and went to Hawaii for a nice pay raise, and he's now the Director of Western Pacific Programs for Oceaneering and works on submarine maintenance out of Pearl Harbor and in Guam. So Dave, take it over, and thanks for being here and moderating the panel this morning.
Hey Bill, thanks for that kind introduction. It's really nice. Not sure it's warranted, but it's nice. You can see it coming. Just as H.G. Wells could see a nuclear revolution coming in the early 1900s as he wrote in his novels, today we can see it coming. As I asked Alexa as I was preparing for this thing, what is hyperwar? And she blurted off the definition that it is a artificial intelligence infused, machine enabled revolution where the human is removed from the decision loop. And as the wamba went across my living room, I could see it coming. You can see it coming. The members of this panel can see it coming better than almost anyone. We have, and I will introduce them separately later, Mr. August Cole, Mr. Amir Hussein, and Captain Sean Heritage. They have articulated it. They have been part of it. They can see this human revolution coming. It's not a revolution in military affairs, as Amir would tell us. It's a revolution in human affairs. And it's how that revolution in human affairs bleeds over into the use of violence for political ends that we're really trying to get at today. That term we call hyperwar. So can you see it coming? Just as H.G. Wells saw it, we've seen it in the movies. We saw it in 2001 Space Odyssey. We saw it in Ex Machina. We see it in movies like Terminator. We know that it's coming. We can feel that it's coming. Can we embrace it? Can we figure out how to harness it? Can we figure out how to use it for human good and to deter wars rather than to have to fight them? Those are the major questions before us today. Those are the major questions before the panel. Rate me a bit of a skeptic as someone who's been working innovation in the military for 31 years. Today I struggle as I use my flip phone inside classified areas to do work. How many of you have that problem? So we have big challenges ahead. Do we still remember the lessons of what it took to bring nuclear power to fruition? Could today's military tolerate a Rickover or a Graves or even a Wayne Hughes? Those strong leaders with their idiosyncrasies who drove innovation. Can that happen? Just ask Ed DeWinter, who's up front here, or Antonio Ciordia. For 2 years, we worked really hard to bring innovation to the 7th Fleet with some success, but it's really hard inside the current military structure. And I know all the defense contractors here know how hard it is. So we could talk about hyperwar, but how we bring together the community to deliver hyperwar for the benefit of the United States is a huge question. But also count me an optimist. The reason you should count me an optimist is because we're all here together, and it all starts here. People may not believe that, but there's a sign out there that says victory begins at the Naval Institute. Well, victory does begin at West. It begins because of the conversation is happening, the open, honest conversation that the Naval Institute under the leadership of Pete Daly brings. And it happens because of the community, organizations like AFCEA under the leadership of Lieutenant General Shea, who are bringing people together to solve the problems. You have to talk about the problems, figure the problems out, and then bring industry together with the military, and that's what West is. So victory starts here at West, and we're really appreciative of the Naval Institute and AFCEA for this panel. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Mr. August Cole. He really merits no introduction. He's written one of the best accounts of what future war might look like in ghost fleets. He's a senior fellow at the Skrokov Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's director of the Art of War projects. He's really a known expert. He's been on television shows, he's written, he's reported on defense, and he's one of those key futurists who could tell us what it looks like, and that's why we're happy to have him. He has a BA from Penn and a Master's in Public Administration from the Kennedy School. Without further ado, Mr. August Cole.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be, as a person who makes stuff up, to be on a panel alongside such accomplished people. 190 years ago, by my liberal arts math, Jules Verne was born. It's his birthday today. And he's an important figure for people like me who spend a lot of their hours thinking about the future. Ray Bradbury, who I think is probably one of the finest American science fiction writers, said of Jules Verne, "We are all in one way or another the children of Jules Verne." The ability to take really rigorous looks at the world around us and extrapolate that forward into magical inventions like submarines, like space travel, is the kind of opportunity that is ongoing, but there are also moments when it's increasingly relevant. And I think we are, again, at one of those moments, probably akin to like what we saw in the 19th century, where the power of the ability to imagine is as important as what we can accomplish technically. In part, I see this from the strategic point of view, which is there is really no reason to be surprised by anything anymore, because there are so many accomplished and talented people thinking hard about the future, not only in the ways that are accommodating the status quo, but of course in ways that are disrupting it. That, of course, includes the adversaries that are out there, from nation states to individuals, and so we have to always be mindful of that. I'm going to talk a little bit for a couple minutes before I pass over to the other panelists about how we might see some of the forces at work technologically and human that Amir ably described in his Hyperwar essay in proceedings. I think one of the really important things to think about when we talk about autonomy is that it's very hard to define and understand, and not just for a layperson, but I think even in the technical community, there is a lot of conversation about what exactly it is. But I'm going to kind of brush that aside for a minute and really lead us down a path to think about the kinds of technological breakthroughs that autonomy might present the military may actually be really only crossing the Rubicon, if you will, whether it's in a kill chain, whether it's in targeting during wartime. That this is the sort of innovation that I think we're going to have a lot of trepidation about setting loose, so to speak, until we absolutely must. And that worries me, because if we're going to be of that mindset, then we're going to miss the opportunity to think about ethics, to think about operations, to think about efficiency, to think about the kinds of ways that we can operationalize in the most effective way possible almost existential levels of innovation. You know, one of the ways that this is manifest today, of course, is in the cyber domain, electronic warfare, but you're going to see more and more of this entering into the realm, from my perspective, in not only defensive operations that are kinetic, but offensive too. And one of the constructs I've come up with, and this is a little bit clumsy, so forgive me, but I'm an aspiring dog owner. We hope to adopt a rescue dog soon. And I was kind of thinking about the idea of autonomy being a bit like you're introduced to an animal and you're trying to get to know it for the first time. And in the way that we interact with our dogs, there are places where, for example, you can take your dog on the leash, off leash, in different times of year. Where I live, there's beaches that allow you to, in the wintertime, run around with your dog on a leash. Summertime, it's no-go. Yet you go in the winter and everyone's running around with their dogs off the leash. And it usually works out pretty well. little nipping and barking occasionally, but everybody gets along. And the reason why the metaphor, I think, is important is that we're used to having a sort of dominance and control over our domesticated animals, but these are very independent creatures that we are emotionally connected to. And I feel like that emotional connection to technology is really, really important. I was talking to somebody that works in the unmanned domain the other day about how they felt about the thing that they worked on. And it wasn't love that person felt for that program. It was, a stronger, kind of more strident feeling of frustration, because that's also another side of technology. We don't just love our phones, we also throw them across the room. By domain, quickly, I'm going to run through because I've had a machine cut me off there. In the naval domain, obviously, you're going to see a lot of sub-hunting turned over to autonomous systems using a lot of machine learning. But what if we had battle groups that were maneuvered, the ships themselves, by mesh AI? Really not just narrow AI, but almost artificial general intelligence, which we don't quite have yet. Imagine that the very basic maneuvering of ships in combat, for example, was not something that a human entered into. There's some really existential questions around that for this service, the Navy, of which most of you here are involved with, but also the other forces as well. I'll talk about some of the other domains during the course of the panel, but it's something I think a lot about in the same way that Jules Verne did, by using fiction to get at these issues. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to the panelists.
Yeah, so I didn't think the alarm would actually go off when I had the volume down, but it thinks that by its on its own.
That's a human-machine teaming right there.
Yeah, poor human-machine teaming. So thank you very much, August, and August will be able to offer a lot more. I'd like to introduce Amir Hussein, who's the founder and CEO of SparkCognition. He was talking how this has gone in 2.5 years, his company, from one man in a PowerPoint to over 300 people who are working this very difficult problem of machine learning and AI-driven cognitive analysis. He has over 50 patents in his name, some of them not approved yet, but many of them approved. His company won the Global Innovation Award in 2014 and the Nokia Innovation Challenge in 2015. He was personally the Austin Entrepreneur of the Year, and he is the author of a new book, which I encourage everyone to read, The Sentient Machine, about these topics that we're talking about today. So there's no better person on this topic than Amir Hussein. Amir?
David, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I must acknowledge that the early work on the concept of hyperwar was done in collaboration with General John Allen, who was the Deputy Commander CENTCOM and also Commander ISAF. He's a dear friend and also a great thinker, so I owe him a lot in developing these concepts. The idea behind hyperwar is actually to consider what happens when artificial intelligence fuses with the needs of the conduct of war. And this is something that happens across multiple domains and in many different areas. But one of the things that we realized early on was that the relationship between intelligence and firepower is actually an inverse relationship. And what I mean by this is to say that over the last many decades, for example, as we prosecuted bombing campaigns in the Second World War, we found that we had to drop a very large amount of ordnance to take down a target because we lacked accuracy, we lacked intelligence. By the time that the Gulf War came around, we found that we could use a JDAM kit and transform something that was not very smart previously and was now very smart. And that one kinetic element could take the place of a much larger number of dumb, unguided bombs. Okay, so this is a very basic example, but in your military discipline, you can abstract this all over. Whether you watch somebody, exercise martial arts, or whether you see a B-52 versus a single JDAM being dropped somewhere, the principle that's working there is that intelligence and firepower have an inverse relationship. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because in the age of hyperwar, one of the biggest changes that will happen is that decision-making will become federated, inexpensive, embeddable, universal, and also capable of collaborating in hive minds as swarms, ways in which decisions haven't yet been made, in conventional warfare. So we can talk about weapon systems, and we can talk about the new Chinese AI-powered missile, and we can talk about what we'll do to counter that, and we can talk about where the gaps are and the S-400 and what we'll do to counter that, which of course we'll get into those things here later on. But always keep in mind that the fundamental thing that's happening here is that the same size of force, if it could take X decisions previously, a competent force of some size could take X decisions previously, the injection of intelligence and autonomy allows that X to be multiplied manyfold. And if the relationship, the inverse relationship between firepower and intelligence hold, then artificial intelligence and autonomy, i.e. hyperwar, present opportunities the likes of which we've never seen. So for example, do you need to blow up a tank, or can you fly into the barrel of a 125 millimeter gun with a much smaller charge? If you had that level of precision and you had that level of customization of payload, perhaps the latter would suffice in many cases. But these examples abound. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is not in the kinetic domain, it's actually in the information domain. One of the things that we've now got with the ability to make decisions so broadly and to automate these decisions is that we've essentially created a new domain, but the guys in the military haven't really created this domain. Really, it's the politicians that have created this domain, but now it exists. And that is the domain of your everyday information space, whatever you want to call it. Your popular media, things that the population in the country reads, and so on and so forth, what you post on social media. Artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to weaponize the data that's available publicly. It's being used to create profiles, to do very, very micro-targeting. In the book, The Sentient Machine, I talk about mind hacking. And I talk about the need, for example, for AI shields. These are new classes of threats that are materializing because artificial intelligence has been inserted into this process. In these short remarks, I can't do justice to the full breadth of what the implications might be. But then also think about it in geostrategic terms. Another aspect, another consequence of hyperwar, and we've written about this extensively also, is that it changes how we see the world. One of the principal ways in which we've evaluated the military potency of any country is, for example, the number of able-bodied citizens it can field and make part of a military. And that is also going to change. You see states in parts of the world that are rich, they have access to capital, they could put up dark factories, they could invest in roboticized factories that produce advanced equipment and goods. And those can now autonomously undertake campaigns. So you still need humans, but what's the multiplier? And what is the capacity of a country that erstwhile would not be able to field any significant threat, any significant capability, but with this dawn of hyperwar and the advent of AI technologies, those calculations change also. So I'll stop at this point, but my opening remarks hopefully introduce you to three aspects. One, a very practical element of where artificial intelligence can make weapons much more smart than they are now and can decrease lethality while still maintaining effectiveness. That artificial intelligence is the principal means of the conduct of operations in an entirely new domain that the military didn't define, the civilians defined, the information space. And third, that the advent of hyperwar opens up a reinterpretation of our geostrategic future by allowing us a new framework and a fabric with which to look upon states that we have otherwise perhaps not thought of as importantly, or some that we've given too much importance to. The framework is adjusted, and therefore the rebalancing, at least the mental rebalancing, now needs to take place. So with that, I'll conclude my opening remarks.
Thanks, Amir. Captain Sean Heritage is one of the Navy's premier cryptological warfare officers. He served all across the globe in that capacity. He served as the commanding officer of Naval Information Operations Command Pensacola. and as the operational commander of Task Force 1020, which is at the forefront of cyber warfare. He's currently at Defense Innovation Unit X, where he works with industry to bring the military and industry together to come up with innovative solutions to many of the problems we talk about. He's a 1992 graduate of the Naval Academy and has a master's from Johns Hopkins and the Naval War College. It's my pleasure to introduce Captain Sean Heritage.
All right, thank you, David. Can you hear me? I can't hear myself. Over the course of this panel, you're going to notice that one of us doesn't just quite fit in. As I look across the panel, there's one thing that is very obvious to me that separates me from the other three, and that is I'm not wearing a jacket. So in order to remedy that, and acknowledging that I'm representing Silicon Valley as well as the United States Navy, I'll wear my jacket.
Now you're finally one of us.
Yes, now I feel like I fit in. Another thing that you will soon realize is I'm not an expert in hyperwar, but I do represent a team, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, that was stood up by Secretary Ash Carter and still thrives today under the leadership of Secretary Mattis, that is out there to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the innovation that is happening that we need within the United States military and the Department of Defense is being developed in the private sector with very young startups that are very capable in ways that we are not. So we are all about partnerships. So much like my jacket represents that intersection between military and the private sector, that is the mission of the Defense Innovation Unit. So rather than talk deep about hyperwar, I wanted to share some thoughts about observations we are seeing in the investment of other nations in the area of artificial intelligence. So though our focus up there in Mountain View is to focus on partnering with young startups to bring on AI expertise, both in the form of capability as well as expertise to help develop it, most visibly with Project Maven, let's talk a little bit about what China is doing in the AI world. So they've declared their intent to become the world leader in AI by 2030. Right? So should we believe that? Well, if we look at the fact that they've committed to $2.1 billion to develop an AI center, that's a rather significant commitment. Where's our AI center? They've committed in their 5-year plan to invest $150 billion in AI. Project Maven's a start, but it pales in comparison to that. The magnitude of Chinese publications in deep learning exceeded that of which we are developing in the US in 2014. And I'd imagine that those two lines will never intersect again. Their military-civil fusion creates structural advantage for them over us. And as we look and see that their visible presence up in the valley and investing in virtually every AI startup, if you look at the makeup of the startups in AI arena, the team is largely Chinese, or at the very least very foreign. So I've mentioned that just to acknowledge that, just as Amir did, we are far from alone in our investment in this arena, but we are not investing nearly as much. The number of people that are focused on becoming experts in this field are clearly, they pale in comparison as well. So the other thing that DIUx represents, and that we're very proud of, is the fact that a lot of these foreign nationals, they may not have started their life as American citizens, but many of them are now, and many of them are committed to solving problems that are of mutual interest in the public and private sector. So one of the things that I've learned in my short time, I've been on the team for 6 months, is the number of patriots, of now Americans, that are willing to share their knowledge and develop capability that we could not develop within our military and that we could not develop with traditional solutions. Not to diminish partnerships with traditional commercial companies, but to acknowledge that our focus is that of growing the team, not in creating a competition between traditional partners and these non-traditional companies.
Thank you very much, Sean. You know, one of the things that's interesting is in the last week or so, we've seen the Chinese put a naval railgun to sea and operate that. So that's very interesting how they're, and across all fields, they are competing. And that concept was also drawn out in the movies and in Ghost Fleets, imagining what that might look like, what that might be. So I want to give August a little more time to kind of extrapolate on the concepts you had in mind that we're looking at as it ties in with what Amir and Sean have said.
A lot of the challenges that we're going to face are internal. That the adversary has an acquisitions track, a unified approach to some of these really critical technologies, but I think we have to be really clear, though, that if we want to make decisive gains in a strategic environment, as laid out, for example, and codified in the latest national defense strategy, we really got to take a really hard look at ourselves. Sean's work at DIUx is a really important part, but the defense ecosystem in the United States is as big as anywhere in the world, which is both opportunity, but it shows the scale of the responsibility. So when you start thinking about challenges that we face, for example, like securing North Korean weapons of mass destruction sites, how are we going to go about that with the force that we have today? If we start to overlay autonomy in the context of what the Hyperwar framework has been presented by Amir, we start to think about the ways that we can assign roles to machines that we would have otherwise had to give to highly trained soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen. That's not necessarily a novel concept. But the closer we get to those really high consequence engagements and contingencies, where there are consequences that are existential, the closer we're going to get to using these existential technologies. One of the things that I played with in a fictional context for this very reason was to use a sort of killbot to secure a weapons of mass destruction site. You know, you can deploy a special operations command, team, Rangers or SEALs, but the proliferation of dangerous technologies in a country like North Korea, deliberately hid throughout in fortified locations, overwhelms what we can even accomplish with the forces that we have. So in the hyperwar context, then the question is, how do we go about doing that? Now, that's not a very sophisticated technology. I'm talking about those systems exist today. But the political will to do so with forethought, not in response, is, again, part of that internal examination and re-engineering almost in the same way we'd examine a system that we have to do. That, to me, is part of, I think, if anything that I would explore in my fictional domain, further, it's really trying to understand process. Now, that's really hard to write a short story about bureaucracy and heroes, but there was a reason in Ghost Fleet why we had a first-generation American as one of the decisive players in the cyber campaign. There are patriots throughout the civilian sector that maybe not fit the framework of what the conventional defense industrial complex is associated with innovation, but we have this opportunity and responsibility to go much farther than we have before.
Thanks. Amir, in your work, actually trying to deliver hyperwar or technologies that enable hyperwar, what have you seen as some of the biggest challenges, and maybe what is the biggest opportunity we have to actually bring hyperwar to the field and the fleet?
I'm going to try and talk really fast because there's a long list. But I have to say that our partnership with DIUx, by the way, has been fantastic, and DIUx played a huge role in opening that first door. Our partnerships also with Boeing and with General Atomics have gone really, really well, and with some other traditional suppliers that we'll announce here shortly. But coming back from all of that, let's just talk about what we're doing. So a lot of the technologies that people have sort of referred to as sci-fi, we're building them. So for example, we are taking commercial drones, off-the-shelf, inexpensive drones that we can buy in the tens of thousands and putting really lightweight neural networks on them to do recognition of an entire library of databases for tracking, for ISR, for targeting, for whatever you like. We are developing, at Softworks, we demonstrated an early prototype of a drone magazine, which again takes commercial, inexpensive, throwaway drones that can carry enough of a payload to be useful in many different contexts, whether it's a non-lethal payload or a kinetic payload, and to be able to launch those rapidly and to have a modular launch system that tracks all of that. The software that will control all of these things in two ways. One, the swarming algorithms, of which we've written extensively. We've published papers around that technology and how we believe that we can incorporate safety in those swarming algorithms by leveraging elements of the blockchain, for example. But then also going beyond that and providing individual assets the level of autonomy that they need to break away from a swarm and then conduct some action. We've developed capability that fuses image analysis with language, natural language analysis. So for example, today if you have N drones, camera feeds, whatever your source of imagery is, the job of an analyst is to look at all of that and to say, okay, I saw this and I saw this and I saw that, and create basically text reports that are then studied, collated, and put together to determine whether this was something of interest or not. To be able to automate that means that you've essentially removed any bandwidth constraint from the number of such eyes in the sky or eyes anywhere you like that you need deployed. We're working on that actually with one of the largest suppliers of drone systems to the government now, to the armed services now. Within that image recognition capability, there's tremendous opportunity. On the cyber domain, artificial intelligence and cyber, both for defensive and offensive, we have a product out today called Deep Armor that's totally machine learning based. It blocked all major zero-day threats that came out over the last 6 months. And the flip of that is an offensive capability that's available only to certain clients. But my point is, I can go on and on and on. The technology of hyperwar is real. It is consumable in various different levels of readiness. It is consumable. I think the comments that were made earlier this morning at the keynote, the comments that I had the good fortune of making in Brussels to the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and that I will go and repeat again here in the next month at the NATO summit, the comments that I've made to former Secretary Bob Work, and everywhere where I could find people that I thought have influence on this process. We've got to fix acquisition. There are many good ideas in this country. We've got the best universities still in America. AI was born in America. We still have the largest number of AI researchers in America. But if you let these ideas die on the vine, what's the point? That is a disconnect that needs to be resolved. DIUx is a huge step forward in that. SCO, huge step forward in that, but more. There's more ideas than there are organizations with bandwidth to take them somewhere. And as somebody that represents industry, but really more than that, I could probably take the technology that we have in different areas, and we do. I mean, national security is one of our areas, but we also have financial services, which is a reasonably large business for us, and also energy and industry, manufacturing, which is a reasonably large business for us. But I care about national security. This is a key focus. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I'd like for it to succeed. So I think one area where we do need some help is figuring out some guerrilla mechanisms to get this acquisition business taken care of. Once we do that, I think we'll have a leg up.
As Amir points out, the key is that lash up between industry, because we all know that industry is far ahead of the military. For the first time kind of in the military-industrial cycle, the labs used to lead all the innovation, the government labs, but today it's all led by industry, and the amount of investment that industry is putting into the technologies which can be fused together to bring around hyperwar. They're just way ahead. And DIUx was one of our efforts to bring that together. Sean, could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the lessons from that we could expand to do what Amir's talking about?
Absolutely. So I was here yesterday listening to a panel on this very stage. I listened to Secretary Hondo, Gertz, this morning as well. And there's a lot of talk about the acquisition and how it needs to change. There's a lot of talk about culture and how it needs to change. And as I look around the room and just the fact that you people are here today, I'm sure we're not talking to you. We're talking to the people who aren't here. So the question becomes, how do we as leaders at representing our various teams help others get what we already see? Right? How do we scale the culture that we represent? How do we help others who have the positions of authority to leverage the authorities that we have already been granted for the greater good. Yesterday, there was significant talk amongst the 3 stars about the risk aversion versus risk management, and the fact that our contracting community has been wired to, maybe due to us and their conditioning, wired to not accept any risk. So DIUx is but one organization with OT authority. We're not the only one, but we're going at it in a creative way, a totally legit way. We're not bending any rules, but fortunately the NDA has given us some authorities that allowing us to deliver things much more quickly than otherwise, to give people reason to want to do work with business or do business with the DoD that were normally afraid to. The barrier to entry was too much. So to me, I think the real lesson that we've learned is that it is possible, that we can move rather quickly, and that we need not be the only organization within the DoD operating the way we are. So 2018 for us is the year of scaling to help others do what we do so that we are not the only ones who do it. So other people have these very similar authorities. They may be going about leveraging them in a very different way. So that's one of the things that we intend to do, is to help coach others, to partner with DAU, to help educate those who are running the processes in the acquisition world, to acknowledge the fact that they can do things a little bit differently. And those who dare to take responsible risk, that we promote them and incentivize that behavior as opposed to the same old behavior that's going to generate the same old results and frustrate all of us.
Thanks, Sean. So I hope that kind of sets the scene for everybody about what Hyperwar is about, the technological opportunities and challenges we're facing. But we really want to answer your questions at this point. So we have microphones in the back. We'd love to take your questions.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Ron Fritzmeyer, I'm the chief engineer at SPAWAR. I love this stuff. If you'll let me tell you a little story as part of my question. A couple years ago, supporting NAVC as part of trying to figure out how to drive cybersecurity into the fleet so that it's actually change in the fleet posture, right? The then commander of SPAWAR made a really great statement. We can change anything in the Navy in 30 years. So the question I have for the panel, and it's more just sort of maybe in the form of discussion, is the notion of innovation and understanding opportunities for bringing technology into to potentially fundamentally transform some of what we can do in terms of the naval mission. Great. We absolutely want to do it. I mean, every day I certainly talk with my folks. How can we move faster? How can we make processes easier while maintaining the technical rigor, right? So that we address the risk, we manage the risk. Totally, I'm totally there. I think in general, actually we are. It's not just the acquisition process, it's also how we integrate it into the fleet that we have today. What we can't do is just throw away what we have today and create a new thing, at least not for the most part, right? That's just not fiscally real. So I'm really interested in, what do you see as some of the other opportunities to go beyond? It's kind of like in the classic O&R sense of the valley of death. Great idea, getting it to a program, the gap in between is like infinite, right, in most cases. What are your thoughts on things that we can do to try and drive that gap, to close it, so that we can actually bring some of this incredible capability, transformative, into the Navy sooner, faster? Thank you.
I'd like to give each of the panelists a little opportunity to address this very quickly, but it's clearly the challenge, right? 3 years ago, the Commanders Initiatives Group did PanderaNet. We put more bandwidth on Fort Worth than the entire 7th Fleet, but we can't bring that to the fleet for a number of reasons. So how do we get there? I don't have the answers, but let's let Amir take it first really quickly, and then we'll pass it down.
I'll give you a really tactical, sort of a practical answer. We worked with NAVC and developed a 3D model of the bridge of an Arleigh Burke. And the idea there was not just to say, now you can wear virtual reality goggles and you can see what the bridge looks like, but the idea was one of a completely virtual upgrade of the ship, So the system that we put together, you wear the glasses and you see all the instrument panels where they are, but they're no longer showing you the visualizations that the current older systems show you. Because all of the computational layering of the actual experience that goes on top of that panel now is being replaced in virtual reality with different pixels that are coming from an out-of-band, completely upgraded system that may or may not even exist on the ship. Any upgrades to information systems using virtual reality can be trialed. You can bring in AI prognostics for systems by tying into the SCADA that you do have on the ship, by adding wireless sensors in certain areas. For example, we've had multiple turbine failures and three pump failures last year that resulted in LCS and Zumwalt incidences. All of those were basically failures that a sophisticated AI-based vibration and analysis system, of which we build them for large turbines, could have dealt with. The problem is you go in and you talk to NAVC and they say, excellent, wonderful, but it takes N amount of time, N number of months, whatever, to actually put that on. So it's got to be stick-on, it's got to be interfaces, virtual reality, there's got to be a lightweight, here it is. And with that, you actually increase capability, not just from a maintenance perspective, but also from a survivability perspective. Because the bridge now exists in the virtual world. All the instruments are virtually connected. As long as the connectivity to the physical systems is maintained, you can be anywhere, and you can don this visor, and you can be on the deck, on the bridge. So that's a survivability capability also. Point is, there's lots to do, and the answer isn't rip and replace and hundreds of millions of dollars for every upgrade. We can be a lot smarter than that, a lot smarter.
August, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, a quick one. I think there's an element of advocacy that is important with two constituents that are not necessarily addressed on these kinds of issues, and that maybe don't really understand the stakes for very short, the long-term stakes for very short-term and understandable reasons. You know, one is Congress, which plays an important role in accommodating failure in programmatic, right? However, there are ways around that, not just direct outreach, but Secretary Gertz this morning talked about almost taking a more appropriate scaling of the designation of an acquisition program, taking everything out of the ACAT-1 concept down to lower threshold, lower attention models of management. And that may be really effective because it might allow people to stay below the surface, so to speak. But I do think that we can't do enough to educate the congressional community about the long-term risks if we botch this really pivotal moment in technological defense innovation. And the second is the investor community. When a small company engages with a venture capitalist, they are looking at liquidity events down the road, thinking about how to ramp up as much revenue and hopefully profitability as possible. And doing business with the Defense Department, from people who I've talked to, and Amir can probably speak to this as much as anybody, there are big trade-offs when you do that. The other is the large institutional investors for our biggest public defense companies as well, that have very different priorities that force management and boards to think really short term. The system works that way, but that's really going to hamper us if we can't make the kind of long-term investments. So those aren't necessarily about pipelining a given technology or given innovation, but unless you kind of clear away that brush, you don't have a clean shot at making it.
I was struck by Amir, talking about wireless sensors and the things that we could do, and then I was like, man, if we try to do that, the cyber defense bureaucracy of what he described is really going to shut us down really fast. So, Sean, can you speak to that? Is there a way we can get past all the controls that we have on cyber defense in order to actually do an AI-infused hyperwar, some of the things that Amir talks about?
Well, absolutely. We control our own policies, right? But it's all culturally. So we talk about projects that we do at DIUx. It's really projects that we do anywhere. They have to be all of three things to succeed. They have to be operationally desirable, they have to be technically feasible, and they have to be organizationally viable. Our approach is to not worry too much about the organizationally viable piece just yet, and to get people to buy into it over time once we prove to them that it's possible. But, sir, to your question, we've out of the gate, there's 4 of us full-time Navy folks at DIUx, and we're trying to create opportunities to solve problems with and for the Navy. We focus first and foremost on SPAWAR out of the gate. And one of the challenges that we have is that, we are held back by what some deem to be organizationally viable. So whether it's cybersecurity, we don't want to take responsible risk, we want to take no risk. So I go back to my last job where I was the commanding officer of Navy's Cyber Defense Operations Command, and the mandate to operate our network as a warfighting platform. Taking that very seriously, we operated in such a fashion that we minimized that risk. If you look across the fleet, we are not doing that. We are accepting, in many cases, irresponsible or unknown risks. So we have to find that balance and hold ourselves back so we are responsible, but to acknowledge the fact that if we are totally risk averse in the cyber domain, then we're not going to give our teammates the tools that they need to do their jobs.
If I may just toss out, the fleet is very supportive right now of us trying to get into, I'll say, more experimentation. And I think that might be a piece of this issue of how do we drive experimentation faster where we're helping to manage some of the risks while we're learning, hey, this is really the mission value of some of these capabilities that you're talking about. So I look forward to more discussions later. Thank you.
Thanks. Sir on the left.
Thank you. My question is about capturing the imagination of the bureaucracy. And I'd like to start with an example of DIUx and how they've captured the imagination of the Marine Corps. I'm Major Brandon Newell with the Marine Corps. I lead the Autonomous Vehicle Proving Grounds right here in Miramar. Qualcomm right now is doing testing of their autonomous vehicles. We don't care about their IP. We care about their deep market forecasting, about how that emerging market will come about and how we can intercept it. So some of that started with DIUx working in air taxis. So Joby Aviation was one of their contracts. In September, I went to deep into the training area of a Central California base, and I watched 35 young engineers every day living in a tent, working for Joby Aviation, flying their platform over and over and over and over. And the FAA was there the same day that I was there. FAA gave them their experimental license to go back to Santa Cruz and fly, because the opportunity afforded to them by DIUx to fly every day in restricted airspace that FAA would not allow previously. And so we see bases as this asset, not just for ourselves, not just for operations, but for the state, for industry, especially in autonomy and autonomous vehicles. So capturing the imagination in AI of what we can do today, that's my question for the panel. Thank you.
I'll take a go at that as the person who writes science fiction stories. I think it is a really proven tool to engage much broader communities than you might otherwise with a given concept. You can prototype with fiction when the stakes are low, right? This is imaginary. You can connect with people who are not necessarily going to be ready consumers of a white paper. When the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab was looking at its strategic environment forecast, they decided to work with the Art of the Future project on creating science fiction vignettes for that, with the express intent of creating a document that could be relatable and accessible to much more than the wonks who crank away trying to figure out what the future is about. So that sort of experimentation and permission to take those kinds of steps, I think, is really important, because the imagination now and the possible, technologically speaking, are ever closer linked.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that in my actual experience, we've seen this with the special operations community, where we've been able to run some ideas by them very quickly at SoftWorks. And now we have a number of people saying, hey, when can I try this in a field trial? And that's really valuable. It goes beyond just the use of the base. It actually goes to the use of a training exercise, the kind of validation you get from there. And really, we're interested in end user feedback. Just like with any product development cycle, it's useless until the end user finds value in it. So that, to me, is a very positive sign. And certainly, I'd love to see more of it. On the aerial autonomy side, it's a little bit more complex. And you've just given me a good idea, so thank you. That might be something to pursue. But the special ops guys have been helping us in that way. Yeah.
Sir, your question on the right.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your time thus far. John Dietenhofen, United States Marine, currently in a retired status, and I'm currently with QTech Solutions. We make software, longtime software makers for not just obsolescence management of electronic components, but also anti-counterfeit. And this is to Mr. Cole. I will tell you that regarding fiction, I mean, your Ghost Fleet novel has absolutely generated a tremendous amount of dialogue within our community. And this actually speaks more towards the actual feeling of technology. One of the conundrums that you brought up was the fact that 78% of all components or all microchips produced for one of our 5th generation systems were manufactured by a potential adversary. Now, somebody who's keenly interested in this sort of thing, in your research, what have you found of ways you can potentially best secure the supply chain to prevent such a hardware hack?
Well, it's a really good question to ask a liberal arts major. The book has been effective in creating almost a safe space to have a lot of those really hard conversations about supply chain vulnerability in industry as well as government. So I think just the very fact that you can get two sides of the equation talking about the same risk without recrimination, without anything that is sort of bureaucratically driven fear is important. The notion of trusted foundries, of course, has been around a long time, and it's something that is really practically very difficult, but maybe necessary. The technical side of things, again, is probably better spoken to by someone who has a stronger engineering understanding than I do. But there is a realization, though, that this is an issue. And I would say finding that solution, and this may sound a bit simple, but starts with that common understanding that this is no longer a niche issue. If you can use a fictional product, a film, a book, a video game even, to start to have a level set understanding about where there's a blind spot that we just aren't checking because it's a too hard problem or it's bureaucratically unpopular, because nobody likes to bring bad news to their boss. And this is a way effectively to do that without necessarily creating the kind of ire or anger that gets in the way of a solution, because these are solvable problems. We do very hard things every day in this country, great things that these are not unsolvable.
And I think if we found that the only way to secure the supply chain is to build everything that we import from the East here in the US, then we're in trouble, because that's a long-running process and there's a deep integration of that supply chain. So where I find that we need to invest our time and energy, luckily the work of Claude Shannon is an example in front of us. And in information theory, the assumption is that when you transmit a message across the channel violates the message in some way. So we know for decades in computer science mechanisms and algorithms and mathematical guarantees that can be provided on top of known bad components. From distributed systems, we know about, for example, the problem of the Byzantine generals. There are numerous such constructs that allow us to build systems with untrusted components. That's an area that we should become the world's top experts in. We build the safest glue. The low-end componentry that fits into that glue will either not be fully trusted, or you might get lucky and it works fine, or for redundancy purposes, in any case, you want to look at it differently. But there's an entire area here of putting together untrusted components into trusted systems using information theory, using distributed systems, and so on and so forth. And I think that in many cases, one can intuitively see the solution. In some cases, perhaps you would have to think more. But in many cases, you can see the intuitive solution, and I think that's an area of investment for America. It's a strategic area of investment.
Just a quick reminder that the quicker you get to the question, the more questions we'll be able to take and the better answers our experts will be able to provide. So I'll turn to Captain Retired Sam Tangretti back here, who I know will show us how that's done.
I think hyperwar is dependent on use of the electromagnetic spectrum. If I am an anti-access power, the thing I want to do is deny the use of the electromagnetic spectrum to anyone. So my question to you is, can we really burn through that? If I'm North Korea, I don't want to use my nukes to strike cities. I want to use it for EMP, because I know the entire construct you're doing requires the use of the electromagnetic spectrum. So tell me, can we burn through what our opponents, smaller opponents, will inevitably do?
Sean, you want to take the first?
I don't.
Nope.
I don't
All
wanna
right,
take that one.
you're up.
Okay. Sir, there are ways to prevent that issue. So we've done quite a lot of thinking around this. The first item, of course, is that these assets, many of which are components in a hyperwar, are small. They might be autonomous UAS type systems and so on. And in fact, even in the context of the dreaded domestic scenario where some nut flies, a quadcopter with a grenade into a stadium, in that kind of a situation, think about what protection we have today. We have, and I won't name the vendors, but basically we have RF rifles, right, and a prayer. You basically hold the rifle up, and if the range is exactly right, you get to jam the drone, and if the drone is one of those commercial drones that's defaulted to land when it can't get a signal, then God willing it'll land. But that's about what we do today. That's obviously not sufficient. Now, how would you counter that? One way to counter that would be to obviously have a very lightweight Faraday cage structure so that somebody from the ground that's attempting to block an RF signal that drone is receiving couldn't block it. That's a simple little hack, very inexpensive. You can prevent that potentiality. The other thing, of course, is to have autonomy on the drone, because signal loss is not an issue in an autonomous drone. So that's a second layer of protection. And you go on, and I won't provide a blueprint, but you go on, and there are many ways in which you can create protection against these sorts of attacks. So that Faraday cage comment that I made for a small asset, even in an EMP scenario, with no need for ongoing access to RF, even visual cues that allow a swarm to operate the way it's supposed to, or even perhaps acoustic cues that allow a swarm to operate the way that it will allow us to deliver capability even in an EM-denied environment. This is my view.
Okay, I want to answer that in a little bit different way. Part of the way that I've been thinking about this question is that there is a lot of variation in the problem, and that's regional. In Europe, a very dense environment with large cities that are concentrated, nations that are squished together, you're going to have a different approach to network warfare than you will in the Pacific. In the Pacific, it may be a zero-sum game where the way to dominate is to deny everything, to take the grid down. Again, we played with that in Ghost Fleet. But what about continental Europe? The fight there may be to keep the grid up, where information operations could be as crucial to achieving success in a mission or a larger campaign, because your truth can break through another's. And there's a lot of discussion about cyber, about electronic warfare as also being a fairly button push activity. But there is a tactical component to it. It is not a bloodless activity. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And I think we need to appreciate that risk and sacrifice that those kinds of missions may call for. It's something that in fiction I think is really important to try to understand, because it takes people a bit beyond their assumptions about a technological solution and realizes that the reality is going to potentially be far more difficult than that.
Yeah, on the topic that Amir was talking about autonomy, there was a proceedings article in June, Trust the Autonomous Machines by Commander Phil Purnell. It flushes out some of those issues, but will we be courageous enough to trust the machines, to build them correctly, to give them the information they need, and trust them to go out there and fight a war? At the same time, at the lower end, how important is keeping that network up in order to do the whole set of irregular warfare that comes with conflict? So I think those are interesting questions. Do you have a question for us? Oh, no? Okay, let's start over here on the right.
Thank you, gentlemen. Elliot Schroeder with Chassis Plans. I'm also a Reserve Battalion Commander. My question's, I'm sure you're all familiar with the dreadnought effect that happened over 100 years ago. Is there something in hyperwar, whether it's AI or some other tech, that is a dreadnought technology that will obsolete everything?
I don't believe it yet. And remember the dreadnought effect, the key operative word there is effect. There's some news now that the Chinese have deployed artificial intelligence on their boomers, and path planning, avoidance, sensor integration, potentially weapons control, who knows, it's opaque, one doesn't know, that could be offloaded to AI. So, something like that, that's a candidate for the dreadnought effect. But personally, where I am, I'm watching all of this stuff very, very carefully. I don't think that it exists yet. However, I think that large-scale autonomy, swarm-based autonomy, is the most viable, punchy way to deliver these capabilities today. I'm not even talking about the information space. That's a whole different game. A non-kinetic information impact of AI-based systems can be monumental. You can potentially tear countries apart without even firing a single bullet. But on the kinetic side, I do think that where we are with small swarms, highly coordinated, with enough intelligence in a single asset to take over parts of the mission, which is the new kinds of swarm algorithms that are being developed, that we're working on, and I think that's really where it is at the moment. If it turns out that what the Chinese are saying is true, and there's a fully autonomous nuclear boomer going around with avoidance algorithms and fire control and identification, I mean, that would be quite a revelation.
There's a corollary to that too, which you alluded to in the Hyperwar essay and even in that answer, which is the decision-making speed of machines is going to eclipse what the political and civilian control over the military can accommodate. We see how much trouble we have assigning blame for the hacking of the 2016 elections, and we're gearing up for another in November that will certainly see similar interference, perhaps with different objectives. Well, rather the same objective being chaos, but the methods being different, I should say. I think that's a really profound risk in all this that has a sort of cautionary, unappreciated factor to it that we don't really want to confront either, is that our system is not actually set up to conduct hyperwar as it is, not even in the uniform military domain, but in the political and civilian world. I think we would really struggle to grapple with that actually being executed.
Yeah, my view is that hyperwar technologies are so dispersed, from what I talked about, Alexa, all the way up, that it's very difficult to see how they come together in ways that are a revolution in military affairs or that human affairs. But reality is, when you think about it, if it does, and we can't exactly imagine it yet, there's definitely what you talked about. There's definitely a huge change. If we had autonomous robots out there fighting wars completely divorced from the network, and somebody was able to muster those and unleash those, or even micro robots to do those sorts of things, you may get that huge change in warfare. So I think it's out there. We haven't clearly defined it, but when you take the scope of the change that's going on, we better keep thinking about it. Yeah. And Admiral Daly here reminding me of the moral and ethical implications, which are huge, but other people may not be constrained by those moral and ethical implications, and we may not have the opportunity to think about it as they unleash those technologies against us.
Heather Henson, I want to thank you so much for this panel. It's made my 3 days here worthwhile. I have a startup in San Francisco. We're 9 people. And we spent the last 2 years in a room focused on the math of facial recognition. And now we've put this camera together with an NVIDIA chip and edge processing and neural networks and AI, and we can see faces hundreds of yards away. And the reason I want to thank you is because the acquisition process is tricky. And, when you're sitting in a startup in San Francisco, you're not quite sure who to talk to. And I've emailed DIUx, and I'm sure I'm going to hear back soon. But I look forward to that coffee. And so I just want to say thank you. I think I'm the only startup here. Over the last 3 days, I haven't seen anybody like me, and I look forward to, seeing more of this, but somehow getting the startups here.
I'm all for you, and
Amir's
thank you
a
for fighting
startup.
the good fight.
I will say, in addition to that the CNO is hosting a small group right now with a couple other startups that we've been doing business with as well. So I'm happy to say that you are not alone, but I am happy that you are here, and I look forward to that coffee as well.
Yes, sir. Your question.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Commander Craig Allen. I work in the Office of Counterterrorism, Coast Guard Headquarters. So the theme of this conference is great power competition. And certainly when we talk about the technology that enables hyperwar, we tend to think of our peer rivals, China, Russia, et cetera. However, one of the things that we've seen, especially recently, is that the technology that is kind of at the leading edge now will inevitably proliferate to non-state actors. And we've seen in Syria non-state actors launch a sophisticated do-it-yourself drone attack on conventional Russian forces. We see drug trafficking organizations taken to the undersea domain. My question is, what are the implications of some of that leading-edge technology today when it gets in the hands of non-state actors who maybe can't be deterred in the same way that our state actors can? Thank you.
I want to take that first because it's a topic near and dear to my heart. If we only focus on great power actors, and it is our cultural predisposition to do that in the military, we're going to miss a whole threat set from hyperwar that ranges from the insurgent with a UAV and a sensor all the way up to that. And we have to focus on the whole scope, and that really does concern me, like you said, that irregular warfare. And even worse, if we only focus on the high end of warfare against Russia and China, we'll end up getting our butts handed to us by them in other ways, like in the South China Sea and the Crimea and the Ukraine. So it's that full spectrum of what the implications of this are that we really need to address.
I'll just do a real quick response and pass the mic, so to speak. But I think that a lot of the technological possibility, discussed on the panel today, can of course aid warfighting, but it can radically improve resiliency. And this is a bit of a pulling the thread on the chips question. If there are ways we can think about the known problems we have and accommodate them using the tools that we're just imagining today, then our vulnerabilities to those actors are going to decrease. And so I think you can use the same sorts of mindset that an adversary does, not for destructive purposes, but for constructive ones.
Yeah, and again, I completely agree with both the comments that you got. Again, at a very tactical level, what we don't have, for lack of a better word, is an urban safe close-in weapon system. And I've had this discussion with my friends in law enforcement in Austin, for example, which is where I'm from, and I live there, and I'm a UT alum. If you're familiar with UT football, it's huge, and Darrell K. Royal Stadium, seats 100,000 people, and it's all open. I was recently in Las Vegas, unfortunately at the same hotel, just a few weeks prior to that very dastardly event that occurred where that individual killed so many people from a window. I had that same view just 2 weeks prior to that. And as I was sitting in the window, you oversee McCarran Airport. It's a clear view. And you can see the planes coming, and they're pretty slow, and they take off, and they're pretty slow, and they're lined up for a long time. And there's hills around that. And I was thinking, oh my God, there's gates, and there's people, and there's checking of IDs. But if somebody were to fly 4 Walmart drones with some incendiary packages, it would be, God forbid, a disaster. So those threats we aren't tuned to. So the kinds of threats you're talking about, it's not even that we aren't thinking about them and we aren't building for them, because you can't take a phalanx, system and deploy it in Austin downtown. You're gonna take more out than just the drone. So those are the kinds of specific systems. So if you'd like, I'd be happy to take this offline with you. We wrote an extensive paper about the gaps. So urban safe CIWS, detection capability, how do you have to do very large scale swarm engagement, what are some of the ways in which you can do multi-domain denial and so on and so forth. Happy to share that with you if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great, thank you.
I think Amir just hit on a very important point, right? So the problems that you're identifying, we came here together for 3 days as the Maritime Services. But the problem sets are much bigger than us. They're bigger across services, they're across the federal government, they're across the world. So out where we work, the process starts with a problem statement. And what I think would be a very healthy thing for all of us to do is write down some problem statements that we see that we may not have the responsibility or the authority to solve. That may not be problem statements that the Navy, the Maritime Services have by ourselves. Your example about life out there in Austin, I think is spot on. We've been giving a lot of thought to security in stadiums. It's not a problem for the United States Navy. It's not a problem for the DoD per se, but the applications you see, as you've articulated, can't transcend anything that we are directly interested in. Thanks.
Hey, so we're coming to the close here, so we're going to take one final question, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander John Ty, Combat Information Systems Officer on USS Boxer. My question goes to how do we overcome the inherent resistance associated with the way we've always done it? I know in the panel the other day we had all the 3 stars at the table and they all talked about we need to acquire faster, we need to improve this process. Captain Heritage, your comment about getting rid of the length of requirements process, establishing a problem statement and going from there was spot on. However, and down at the unit level on the ships, we're ready for newer technologies. What we've got we recognize is already years old. We're building more and more Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. We've got over 60 of them. The generations, the eras of building new classes of ships, bringing new ideas, new ways of doing things, we're having problems with it. You look at that with the Zumwalt class, the LCS class. How do we get past that legacy of the way we've always done it? In our service members in the acquisition corps, every 3-5 years they rotate out, but a lot of that middle management, the folks whose jobs rely on that program that's been there for 30 years, that significant resistance to slow roll until that uniformed member with the great idea is now gone. How do you get past that, sir?
Well, I think we've all of us have been experimenting with that over time. And I'll reference a nice article written by a colleague of mine, I think it was on the Naval Institute blog, that of the frozen middle. That we see, and I commented on it yesterday, I had a nice conversation with Admiral Becker, that you line this panel and all of our senior leaders are saying the right things. Right? People like you represent those who are inspired by their words. The challenge is just as you had articulated, what's happening in the middle. So if you look around the innovation spectrum or the creative problem-solving spectrum, you see the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. You see the Athena Project. You see these grassroots things that are the Naval Constellation. You see these things happening on the fringes. At the same time, you see the CNO's Rapid Innovation Cell disappear. You see the Strategic Studies Group disappear. You hear conversations that the Navy Innovation Advisory Council may not be long. So it's these mixed messages that I think are confusing a lot of us, and I think giving people like you reason to think maybe there's not a place for me in our Navy, because though I am inspired by what my senior leaders are saying, I'm not getting the support I need I won't say at the local level, but in the middle. So I guess that's a long way of saying I don't have the answer, but please consider me a partner as we try to break down these barriers. And I think what SCO, what DIUx, and what others represent, you heard the question this morning about should there be a NavWorks, like a SoftWorks. These things are popping up, but they're popping up on the fringes. We need to make them part of our organic chain of command.
I don't know about you guys, but for me, this has been a fascinating panel. I have learned so much from all the panelists as they've talked about the questions. And I would just ask you as you leave, we'll stay up here to answer any questions after we close out. But what's been great about this is that victory does start here at West. It's about the conversation led by the Naval Institute under the leadership of Admiral Pete Daly. It's about the community and AFCEA and General Shea. All together, we can solve all the problems that we're talking about, but it starts with the conversation, and we really appreciate all you being here to join us in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Dave started off by saying you can see it coming, and I think this conversation and the questions and the discussion have helped to focus what we can see coming in terms of artificial intelligence and the future of warfare and some of the dangers and risks inherent that we're all going to have to address. So Dave, August, Amir, and Sean, thank you for your insights, for your time, and for your imagination today. To thank you, we have an AFCEA bookmark and a Naval Institute book. The book is called Limiting Risk in America's Wars, Air Power, Asymmetrics, and a New Strategic Paradigm by Phil Mellinger. Thanks, and look forward to the conversations, the kind of sidebars that will happen after this. I think many people in your audience aren't going to let you leave shortly here. So thanks again for being here. Thanks for your kind, your insights and your imagination. It's been great being part of this panel today.
Thank you.